in office right now. Thank you. Now I know. You missed the first part, those that are watching the recording, but now we're recording. So, but now, you know, what I always tell people is the forces that have been working against progress, they're still there, right? The money in politics is still there. The lobbyists are still there. That has not gone away. It has not gone away. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of the bills that I was putting forward to get rooftop solar or to get 100% renewable energy, there was bipartisan support, but there was also bipartisan opposition. So right now, we are in this special, interesting moment. We have a trifecta in Lansing. And so what that means is not that we get to go home and sit in our hands and, you know, celebrate. It's now is the time to actually fight for the changes that we want to see, right? And so, and this is our moment. This is our moment to do that. This is our moment to do that. And when it comes to municipal power, the reason I say that is because Lansing is still not going to save us from DTE and consumers. I can guarantee you that right this moment, Lansing is not going to come and save us. We may get some environmental change. I hope we do. I pray that we do. Not a religious person, but we're in a church, so I pray that we do. I pray that we do. And there may be some specific things that we can get done in Lansing, but I am pretty much convinced at this point, and if I'm proven wrong, then I will say so at a future event after I'm proven wrong. But at this point in time, I do not believe that we will see substantive progress when it comes to issues that DTE and consumers are opposed to. If they oppose it, it won't happen, even in the new legislature. So the work that we're doing here has not changed. Just because we have a trifecta, the work that we're doing here has not changed. What we are doing, as a reminder, is we are liberating ourselves from the corporation that has stopped at nothing to end the ability of our state government to create green energy, to help individuals put solar on their homes. They have used their lobby power, their money, their influence to stop all those bills from moving forward. We are liberating ourselves from that. We are liberating ourselves from the company that charges us exorbitant rates on our bills, that pockets 10% for their shareholders, and that's not even counting the amount that they give to their CEOs. We're liberating ourselves from that. We are liberating ourselves from a company that gives us outages. I was out in Lansing unpacking my office last week. This past week, I was unpacking my office. I was out for 2 days. I came home. All my stuff said power failure on it. I guess there was a power outage while I was gone. I wasn't even here. So, but everything was out. Why was there a power outage? There wasn't even a storm. We are liberating ourselves from that, right? We are liberating ourselves from an environment that the only accountability that they care about is their shareholders. That's the accountability they care about. We want power that belongs to the people. Power that belongs to the people is accountable to the people. Power that belongs to the people is less expensive. Power that belongs to the people is not going to be fighting against the attempts at reducing the impact of climate change. Power for the people is going to be fighting to end climate change. Power to the people is going to be putting solar panels up, wind farms. We are going to be generating our own power here in our community to make sure that our future generations, or that even for ourselves, hell, I mean, climate change is happening so quickly that we'll probably see some of the worst impacts even in our lifetimes at this point. But we have the opportunity to prevent that. We have the opportunity to take charge here, another power pun, take charge here in our community and actually reverse that course. Let's be an example for our state. Let's be an example for other municipalities across Michigan that are hand-wringing and saying, oh, well, we're afraid to be our own municipal utility because it hasn't been done. And what do people say? It hasn't been done in Ohio. So we have the opportunity to say, no, now it has been done. We're doing it. We're doing it. So, all right. Now, a completely different, not completely different topic, similar topic, but I just wanted, before I leave, say something to everybody. Two things. The first is, I want to let you know that one of the last bills that I introduced in Lansing, I don't know if you guys saw this or not, but I introduced a bill to end the corporate monopolies of DT and consumers, and to take all of their assets by eminent domain and have both be run by the state, basically. So we would have a statewide power utility. And so I introduced that bill. That's a whole nother thing, man. I got that bill too. But I introduced the bill to end the monopolies of DT and consumers and to take their assets so that we, the people of the state of Michigan, run our own power statewide. Obviously, we're trying to do something similar here in Ann Arbor, but really the whole state deserves it. And look, my approach to governing is set the goalposts. I know it sounds ridiculous right now, but hey, that's where we want to go. That's where we want to go, right? We want to stay with people, where the people own the power, where the people run the power. And by the way, I can tell you, the Republicans are freaking out about that bill. They're all calling their legislators. It's this wave. Everybody's like, oh, this is terrible. What are they trying to do here? So I wanted to let you guys know about that. And the last thing I want to say is just a big thank you to all of you for being active in this movement. Obviously, I've been now 6 years in office as a state representative, 6 before that as county commissioner, and I look forward to serving again on the county board. But I just want to thank all of you for being committed to this cause and being part of this movement to really take our city to the next level and be an example for the rest of the state. It's because of all of you that we've gotten this far. So showing up to events, organizing events, house parties, whatever it is that you have done to help contribute to this movement, it has been meaningful. I have seen it. And I definitely want to respect and honor each and every one of you for the work that you've done. So with that, thank you for having me. Always into the future, in perpetuity, you can count on my support. Whatever I can do as a county commissioner, I'm here for it. Even looking at maybe doing, if we can look at the potential of a countywide, utility, that would be another approach potentially. But we can cross that bridge later on down the road once I've figured out where my chair is and stuff like that. But something I'm willing to explore, certainly. With that, thank you for having me. Honored to be here. Keep up the good work, and happy holidays.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, State Representative Yusuf Rabi. We're going to miss you in the State House, but we're happy to have you local. So we've got a presentation here that I hope works okay. And I will, some of you might have already seen this. If you have, I apologize, but I will try to make it interesting regardless. And, I want you to all feel welcome to just ask questions as I go. This is mostly just meant as an informational thing to kind of get people up to speed about exactly where we're coming from, what our position is, and kind of what is the pathway here. So Ann Arbor for Public Power, hopefully you've all heard of us. We are a coalition of many local orgs, at least we were originally. We came together, oh, nobody can see this. Yeah, thank you. I don't know. I think it's probably because it's an extended desktop. Pardon us for all of the technical difficulties here.
Curse of technology.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes,
yes,
please.
Yeah. We did it. All right, so we're a coalition of several other local organizations that came together around this topic following the release of the A2 plan. We were looking at the A2 plan, and as Yusuf mentioned before, thinking about what pathways are we looking at to actually achieve these goals, right? And as we were digging into it, we realized that there was not really a clear pathway that Ann Arbor was really planning to get off of carbon-based energy. We have a goal of 100% renewable power by 2030, but we didn't have a realistic way to get there. And when we approached our state senator Jeff Irwin and Yusuf Rabi, and we asked them about what do you think about their current plan, they're like, well, unfortunately, most of the ways that they're looking to be able to achieve this goal rely on state level legislation, which is not super realistic to pass the reasons that Yusuf just mentioned, right? And so we said, well, what do you think about municipalization? And they're like, well, actually, We think that's a much more realistic plan. That's a lot, because we have control over it here. So it led us to form together with a vision of a green and publicly owned energy future, and that's why we're here today. So the problem is that DTE is simply not transitioning fast enough to meet our global or local emissions targets. This is DTE's current energy mix. They just released a new IRP is what it's called, that sets their plan for the next year of how they're going to generate power. It's gotten slightly better, but not a lot better. So this is slightly outdated, but not too much. Still, by and large, their largest source of power is coal, and that will be the case up until 2035 when they plan to retire it. However, they don't plan to retire in favor of renewables. Instead, they're going to continue to expand that fracked gas portion to fill up the missing energy. They are at about 10% renewables. That renewables is a little misleading. Most of it's wind, a little bit of it's solar. The rest is filled in with things like burned garbage. So even with the renewable term, they managed to find deceptive ways to get through that. And this just kind of lays out more clearly. We have a 2030 carbon neutrality date. Joe Biden's actually set 2035 carbon-free electricity date. However, DTE doesn't have a carbon neutrality date until 2050, and even this is not plausible. It's not a realistic plan. DTE has absolutely zero date at which they plan to stop burning frack gas. Instead, what they plan to do is somehow make that carbon neutral with new technology that doesn't exist, right? This is just technological wishful thinking. It is a fantasy to believe that we're going to be able to somehow make frack gas carbon neutral, especially when you consider the fact that it isn't just the emissions from when you burn it. It's the emissions from when you frack it out of the ground, which release methane, which is a far more potent natural gas, fossil fuel or greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and also the transport of it, because these pipelines leak always. So our solution, as we've been talking about, is municipalization. And municipalization is essentially the process of a city taking over ownership of something that is otherwise privately owned, right? So you can think of this term kind of like nationalization would be a nation taking over some sort of private industry. This is a city taking it over. And municipal utilities are not really a new idea, right? In fact, most communities across the US get their water and sewer from a municipal utility. And in fact, a lot of communities actually get their power from a municipal utility. There's over 2,000 across the United States, and there's more than 40 of them in Michigan alone. You can actually see them here in this map. It's a little bit cut off, but you get most of it. And there's no secret why we have so many municipal utilities. It's actually written into our state constitution that this is legal, and it's also validated by what's called the Home Rule City Act. So essentially, a city always has the right to its own franchise. And even though there are some complexities to the Michigan law that I'm going to get into later that makes this tougher, we still absolutely have the right for our own city to own our own power. And we have had this validated by a law firm up in Traverse City called OBH, which are a fantastic environmentally focused law firm. They intervene in a lot of DTE rate cases and things like this. We've also passed this over to the city's attorney, who's validated this. And we've even passed it over to to Dana Nessel's office, who didn't give us any feedback, but certainly didn't say anything negative about it. And so why is it that we believe that a municipal utility is the right idea for Ann Arbor? Well, when you look at municipal utilities across the state and across the country, they tend to be more reliable, more affordable. They give that community local control. They invest in that community. And finally, kind of the driving thing that I think most of us are here for is that they are the environmentally responsible option. So reliability. Now, nationwide, municipal utilities or public power utilities generally tend to be about twice as reliable as their private power utility counterpart. However, in Michigan, it's actually more significant than this. DTE is actually one of the least reliable utilities in the country. And when you look at DTE compared to the city of Lansing, Lansing has the state's largest publicly owned power utility. It's about a 4 times difference, right? Numbers up from 2017. Yeah, they're a little old, but if anything, this has actually gotten more significant as Lansing has gone through a lot of reforms driven by popular movements to actually become more reliable. And in the meantime, DTE's infrastructure has continued to degrade because they
time after time, do not invest in their infrastructure, which has actually driven the state to do an audit of the infrastructure spending that they're doing. MPSC just recently ruled that, which is a pretty big deal and speaks to first the outrage that people are having towards DTE and the power that movements like ours and others across the state have been bringing to put some actual scrutiny on DTE, who previously had kind of gotten whatever they wanted out of the Michigan Public Service Commission. But it's also not just more reliable, it's more affordable. So when you look at public power utilities across the country, again, they're about 14% cheaper than their private power utility counterparts. However, in Michigan, once again, it's more significant than that. Ann Arbor, and this is a few years old, it's actually quite a bit more than that. It's more about 18 cents-ish per kilowatt hour. But if you compare that to Chelsea, who's our next door neighbor, they have a muni. They pay about 40% less for their power than we do. And while a cheaper, better power utility is probably enough of a reason for many communities to want to pursue this on their own, it has some other pretty significant effects. It gives us local control over our power, right? So we would control what our rates are, we would control what our infrastructure is invested. We can look into microgridding, we can look into undergrounding our lines, things like this, right? It's driven by community priorities. And finally, we would control where the source of power comes from, which is, what would allow us to reach our climate goals. Additionally, it invests in our community. Now, I can get kind of wonky here and start talking about how public power utilities tend to pay back more to their community through programs like pilot, payment in lieu of taxes over taxes. I'll get that a little bit more clearly laid out later in the presentation here, but it's important to remember that this also means local jobs, good union local jobs, right? There's a huge issue right now in the environmental space. Most of the solar contracting fields, for instance, are non-union. And the reasons for that are fairly complex, but you can kind of imagine why it would be, right? When everyone's doing these residential installations of solar panels, small jobs that have very thin margins tend to lead to a very competitive environment. It tends to make it harder for unionized work to be competitive. However, if the city was the one that was contracting out these sorts of jobs, we'd be able to do it in bulk, and we'd be able to do it through our responsible contracting policy, which we have at both the county and the city level, which would make it much more competitive for unionized work to be able to get these types of contracts, and would help build out the unionization of the solar industry, which would aid in the whole just transition, right? This idea that we do need to radically change our energy system. However, we can't just leave everyone behind, right? We don't want to take the people who were previously making $40, $50 an hour working in a coal plant and suddenly have them be making $10, $12 an hour installing solar contracting, which is unfortunately kind of the rates right now. So we've got to seriously consider that and take that into account as we're moving forward. But finally, as I think most of us are probably here caring about, it is the environmentally responsible option. Put simply, it allows us to get to 100% renewable power on our own terms. It also allows us to get around a lot of the nastiest things that DTE does at the state level to prevent renewable energy. So for those who don't know, DTE puts a cap on the amount of solar that we're allowed to have. There's a 1% cap. I'm going to take this thing off. I hope I'm not spraying too much over there, but yeah, there's a 1% cap on the amount of renewable power that we're allowed to generate locally. We're actually very close to that cap, and once we reach that cap, DTE gets to say, no more solar. Can't put any more solar on your houses until other generation picks up that isn't using distributed energy generation. If we own the utility, we'd be able to waive these caps. They're set by the utility, the state allows that to be set. So additionally, we would be able to expand city-owned renewable generation, right? There are places within the city or places that the city could buy to build their own solar generation facilities or their wind generation facilities.
We could use the dams that are within the city. Currently, the Energy Commission is considering investigating, putting some work into getting those dams to generate hydroelectric energy. But also we would be able to engage in what's called a power purchase agreement. So we would be buying out all of the electrical infrastructure within the city of Ann Arbor, and with that would come a connection to what's called MISO. MISO is our portion of the national grid, right? It's called the Midwest Interchange something something. And it serves 16 states and counties, and it's not necessarily owned by anybody. It's just like public-private partnership type of deal. And we would be able to connect to that and buy power from power generation facilities all across the state of Michigan and beyond, right? So there is a lot of renewable capacity out there that currently isn't being used because the state does actually put a requirement on DTE to have a 15% renewable generation capacity. However, DTE is not required to use that capacity. And instead what they do is they tend to continue burning fossil fuels because, for one, fossil fuels are more expensive. DTE's has a 10% profit margin built in. So if their costs are $1,000, they get to charge $100. If their costs are $5,000, they get to charge $500. Right? It's actually in their interest to make power more expensive for us, as long as the Michigan Public Service Commission allows them to do it. And so far, they have been pretty conciliatory towards them. So how do you pay for this? Pretty common question anytime you're looking at a large government project like this. And make no mistake, this is an expensive proposition. However, just because it's expensive doesn't mean that it is a bad investment or a bad financial decision for the city, right? So typically the way that you would fund a municipalization attempt is that you would take out a revenue bond. Now, a municipal utility is, instead of us paying our energy bills to DTE, suddenly we're going to be paying our energy bills to the city. So the city is going to be making a lot of money, and they're able to pay off the bonds for acquiring the infrastructure with the money that we just pay on our electrical bills already. And that's actually what you might have heard the city is currently doing a feasibility study to investigate this idea. Part of what that feasibility study does is it looks at what are the electrical rates that we would have to charge in order to pay off that those bonds in addition to just operating the utility normally. Now, typically, because municipal utilities tend to have a lot of cost savings compared to investor-owned utilities, it's actually not too hard for them to both pay off this debt and still stay competitive or even lower than the rates of a investor-owned utility, right? Especially over time, right? Because investor-owned utilities, hopefully that's not a problem, tend to increase their rates considerably faster than their publicly owned power utility counterparts. And additionally, for these utilities that do this, they're not only able to pay off their bonds and operate the utility, they tend to be capable of sending money back to the city in terms in what's called a city fee. So these are 3 cities that have pretty well functioning municipal utilities across the country: Holland, Traverse City, and Lansing. All of them are pretty different sizes, but all of this is a pretty significant amount of money for that city's relative budget, right? City of Lansing, largest municipal utility in the state, made a whopping $23.1 million from their utility. And this is money that is a blank check to the city. City can spend this into any services, sustainability projects, infrastructure investment, anything that they want, right? And so this tends to actually not only be a way for us to have lower prices, especially over time, right? It actually is a revenue generating way, means for the city. Power is one of the most reliable industries to be into. That's why investor-owned utilities are so protective of it, because all these financial firms love to own those stocks because they're guaranteed that they're going to make money. Power only really goes up, especially as we continue to electrify things. We're going to be using more and more electricity, and the margins on that are going to get better and better for whoever's owning that. So our question is, do we want that to be a bunch of DTE shareholders, or that we want that to be us? So this is part, can be a little wonky, but I'm going to try to make it interesting for all of you. This is kind of the legal history that led us to this place, right? Where We have two companies for the most part, Consumers Energy and DTE, that own all of our power across the state for the most part. UP gets a little bit funny, but in the lower peninsula, it's mostly just Consumers and DTE. The late 19th century, electricity is a newfangled thing. Different communities are trying to find a way to be able to get generation. And for a lot of those communities, they went ahead and did it themselves, right? Almost all of our currently existing municipal utilities came from this period of time, right? Where they were building up electrification, they invested in themselves, they built out their power generation, built out their lines. For communities that either couldn't or didn't want to pursue that, however, they turned to the private market and they formed what's called a franchise agreement. Now, a franchise agreement is essentially the city saying, okay, in exchange for you doing a lot of investment to build up power generation and power distribution for us, we will only buy power from you for a set amount of time, right? So 5, 10, 20, 30 years was typically the contract length for a franchise agreement. However, in 1905, something happened. The state was looking at all of the different cities that had formed these franchise agreements with various different smaller power generating companies across the state. And they said, this is a mess. It's too complicated. There's no set legal standard for how we're doing this. So we're going to standardize these contracts. And what they did is they passed something called the Foote Act. Now, Foote just so happens to be the last name of someone who sat on the board of Consumers Energy. And when they managed to pass this bill, they included a little provision in there that eliminated the expiration date on all of these franchise agreements, which meant that these cities that had previously entered into an agreement for 10 years to buy power exclusively from one power provider were suddenly required to buy power from that power provider forever. And this was not very popular. In 1907, people got together and they passed a constitutional amendment saying, no franchise agreement can last for more than 30 years. Seems reasonable. However, the various energy companies sued, brought this up to the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the state is not allowed to change the terms of a contract, which is a little bit silly because they just changed the terms of a contract a few years prior. And I'm not a legal historian enough to really tell you all the various reasons why they thought this was a good idea, other than they were lining their pockets. But this was held up over the course of pretty much the entire 20th century. And in fact, it got worse. Because what the courts further ruled was that when a company acquires another company that has what's called a Foote Act franchise, those franchise agreements are inherited. And slowly over the course of the 20th century, all the various small electrical companies got bought up by either Consumers Energy or DTE. And that led to the situation we have today, where Ann Arbor back in 1896 formed a contract with a small electrical company, I think it was like a Michigan Electric Company is its name or something like that, to provide power to 26 electric light bulbs. Ann Arbor already had their own municipal utility. They just needed some extra help. They wanted a few city streets to have some lighting. So they formed this contract. And then in 1905, it got rewritten to be perpetual. And then that company got bought out by another company. That company got bought out by another company. And that company got bought out by DTE. And now Ann Arbor is stuck in this contract with DTE and can't get out of it. No one other than DTE is legally allowed to provide power to Ann Arbor, except there is a loophole, right? And a loophole, as you probably have guessed, is municipalization. The city always has the right to its own franchise agreement. And that means that if we ever want to stop having to deal with one of the least reliable, one of the dirtiest, and one of the most expensive utilities in the entire country, there's really only one legal pathway for us forward. And that is to take it over ourselves and run our own utility. So how do we do that? Well, good news is we've already started. The city commissioned a feasibility study, as I mentioned earlier, to investigate the costs of this. There's also some other good things in there that they're looking at, like how much renewable power is available, so that we can get an idea of what we would need to build up versus what we could buy, and what would it cost to do reliability upgrades and things like that. But the core of it is, are we going to be able to do this at a rate that is at least comparable to DTE, right? obviously is probably not going to be very popular if we try to increase everybody's power bills by 100%, right? But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of reasons to believe that a municipal utility is actually going to be cheaper, especially over the long run, due to the fact that we're not paying out a 10% profit margin. We're not paying for their lobbying. We're not paying for their advertising. And actually, municipal utilities have some other advantages. Municipal utilities allowed to borrow money much cheaper than an investor-owned utility, right? City debt is actually much lower rate than corporate debt, right? Furthermore, DTE doesn't only raise money from debt. DTE runs money from equity. And the cost of equity is considerably higher than the cost of municipal debt. So there's a lot of reasons why municipal utilities have advantages, and that's why you saw earlier in the presentation, universally across the state, public power utilities are paying a cheaper rate than DTE, and that's just based on fundamentals. So after we get the feasibility study done, we have a couple of options here. Now, what we have listed here is that we can take this to the ballot, and we absolutely can. We can pass a city charter amendment to establish the utility and compel the city to start the process of acquisition. However, we don't need to bring it to the ballot. And if we're able to successfully put pressure on our city council, we can actually get them to do this step by ordinance, which is what we're going to be pursuing first, likely. And then if we are not seeing success at lobbying our city government, we'll be looking to push it forward through the ballot. Then that kicks off the legal fight. Now, as I mentioned, it is absolutely legal for us to do this. But the question is going to be, how much is it going to cost? DTE is going to say it's going to cost this much. We're going to say it's going to cost this much. A court is probably going to decide it costs this much, right? Now, we don't know exactly how long that'll take, but for other communities that do it across the country, looking in the realm of 2 to 5 years. If there's other legal complexities that get involved, that can be extended. However, we believe that we're at actually a better legal standing than most communities that pursue this because we have a very explicit provision within the state constitution to do it. And we already have the provisions within our city charter to allow for this sort of thing because we actually used to have a public power utility in Ann Arbor that we sold off back in the early 20th century. And so once that's done, it does need to go to one final vote. And this vote we can't get out of. It's required by the state constitution, and that's a 3/5 majority vote. So it's a high bar. We need to win by 60%. So we're going to need some help, right? That's where all of our organizing, all of our efforts are really going to have to come and pay off because we're going to need to pass that at the ballot. But hopefully at that point, people will have bought in on the idea. People will know the reasons for doing it. And we'll be able to push this forward. We absolutely believe it's winnable. When we're out there at the doors talking to people, this is by far just a popular idea. We very rarely get opposition to this, but it's not going to just happen on its own. We're going to have to fight tooth and nail on this because DTE is definitely going to fight this like it's an existential threat, which it absolutely is for them. If we're able to do this, we would be the first community in 100 years in Michigan to successfully break free from one of the investor-owned utilities. And that will provide a legal pathway for other communities to be able to pursue this and to be able to do this all across the state. It will fundamentally change the balance of power and force DTE consumers to be much more responsive to the needs of, the citizens. And, it might even put pressure on us to take it further and do like what Maine's looking to do, where Maine is actually pursuing this at a statewide level. And State Representative Yusuf Rabi mentioned earlier, he's already introduced legislation to do that, so maybe that's step 2. Now, some of you might have heard of the city has this idea for what's called a sustainable energy utility, an SEU. This came out of some discussions that happened between the city and A2P2 back early in our kind of advocacy for this. And this is a bit of a compromise position between just, status quo and full municipalization. And the idea is that we would form a utility, but we wouldn't acquire any of DTE's assets, which means that we wouldn't be able to do a power purchase agreement or necessarily distribute, too much power, but it could mean that we could network people's houses together and do some microgridding and we'd be able to do some fancy stuff to get around that 1% cap so we could increase renewables. Overall, it's good stuff, right? And we support the SEU as A2P2. However, if we want to be able to get to 100% renewable for 100% of Ann Arbor, there's really no other way than full municipalization. So we support it as a step along the pathway, but we're going to need to follow all the way through. So finally, I want to leave you with a few successful examples. As I mentioned, this has not happened in Michigan in a very long time, but it does happen around the country fairly often. Some of the most recent ones are Long Island back in 1998. They municipalized their power utility, served well over 1 million customers. And they were able to drop their power bill by 20%. Oh, I think I skipped one. Yep. Winter Park, Florida, back in 2005. I think that this is an extremely inspirational one. And actually, Randy Knight, who was kind of in charge of the effort down in Winter Park, Florida, came and presented to our Energy Commission back in October of 2021. Would really recommend going back and watching that video. It's available on YouTube. But they municipalized because they were consistently experiencing hurricanes down in Florida. However, not being a coastal town, not being super high population, they weren't the highest priority for the utility down there to get their power back on. And they were being left for weeks without power. So they municipalized in order to have local control over the servicing and to be also able to underground their lines. And they were able to, despite having to pay off the debt of acquisition, they were able to reinvest enough money from their utility bills to be able to underground nearly all of their lines. I think that last year when they presented to us, they were at 86, and they were on track to 100% like sometime this year or next. So. I think I saw an article about that. Yeah. Yeah, it's very impressive. I mean, and it makes sense. For one, they're putting more money into their power lines, right? For DTE, every dollar spent on infrastructure is a dollar lost. For a community-owned utility, they have a different incentive structure, right? The reason why they're charging money for the power is because they need money to go into the system, right? But it's not just the finances of it. It's also just the fact that the people who are working on the power lines live in the community. It's a smaller geographical area that they're servicing, and they're able to respond quicker and know about the problems faster. So that really helps them with responding to any outages that might occur, in addition to the fact that the power lines are underground, so they just don't go out as often. Jefferson County, Washington. Now, this is another really inspirational one. Back in 2008, they municipalized for the entire county. They followed 2 years of negotiations, eventually agreed to a $103 million buyout for the electrical infrastructure. They were able to quickly move to a 97% carbon-free electricity mix. Yeah, one of the cleanest in the country. There's only really 6 utilities that are better than that in the country. There are 6 utilities currently that are 100% renewable. All of those utilities are publicly owned. So one of the cleanest in the country, and hopefully Ann Arbor will be number 7 there at 100%. Now, Boulder, Colorado, and some people might take question with us listing this as a success story because oftentimes it's used as the boogeyman in municipalization fights. Boulder, Colorado weighs depending on, they started it about 20 years ago, and then they fought it at the city level for about 10 years. They made some legal mistakes as they went through, and actually, we had a really good roundtable on Thursday where their legal counsel actually came and talked to us about some of the legal mistakes they made. And ultimately, they ended up settling and agreeing not to municipalize. However, they won some pretty huge concessions just for fighting the fight. An 80% greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030. It's one of the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets of any investor-owned utility across the country. In addition to that, they were able to massively get investment into their grid so that they have much more reliable power. And they didn't just take their word for it. They built in check-ins at 2022, 2024, 2027. If the utility is not on track to reach their carbon reduction targets, municipalization starts all over again, right? So they didn't lose necessarily. In fact, Boulder entered into this for much the same reasons why we are, right? We want to see a greener, healthier world. And an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases is far more than they could have possibly gotten by getting Boulder itself to 100%. So just fighting this fight has value on its own. So now, if any of you have any questions or anything that you'd like to raise, happy to answer them. That's also our website there. We've got a lot of great resources that you can find. If you want to get involved, you can also just talk to us here. We're happy to help you get involved with the fight. But yeah, any questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, would we get an estimate of how much it would cost to buy out the assets with the feasibility study? And do we have an estimate already? I believe that Ken Garber, who is a science journalist, just incredibly smart person in general, has done some math to try to map out a rough estimate. I apologize. I personally don't right now have that estimate off the top of my head, but I can get it to you. But yes, really the stronger numbers are going to be coming from the feasibility study, and that will be part of it. However, any number that we come up with is going to be subject to some squabbles, right? DTE is going to, and mostly a lot of that is going to come on two areas, right? So DTE is going to argue that we owe them money for the value of their franchise, right? Because we'll be removing their ability to collect profits from customers because we'll be taking over their infrastructure. So they're going to argue that we have to pay that out, and how much we have to pay out for that is going to be a subject of controversy. And then they're also going to argue on something called stranded assets. And essentially that is DTE is going to argue that they have all of this infrastructure that goes to supporting Ann Arbor that Ann Arbor's not buying because it's not in the city boundaries and we don't need it, right? Most communities will argue that they shouldn't have to pay any stranded assets. Utilities will argue that they have to pay tons of stranded assets. And typically what happens is the city will settle for paying some of the stranded assets just to get it out of court. So exactly where that's going to fit is going to be a subject of legal dispute. But hopefully the feasibility study will do a good job kind of estimating at various levels of standard assets what that would actually look at. Mm-hmm. I think so. So Gus has actually been leading most of our field work here. But yeah, we haven't done a lot of canvassing since it's gotten cold because it's a little hard to even motivate ourselves to get out there in this type of weather. But during the summer and the spring and the fall, we have been canvassing and will be out canvassing. And we tend to get some pretty great responses at the door. We started our canvassing efforts with just trying to get a petition together to actually get the city to do the feasibility study. And we got 1,300 signatures, which was pretty impressive. That really helped us push it forward. But even now we're largely spreading information, trying to gather, like emails for our email list and things like that, identify supporters. Because if we do need to take this to the ballot, we're going to want to know who would be interested in signing. So we're just getting the sign in general. Yes.
Now, why did the MPSC grant most of DTE's rate increase requests?
Well, I would make the argument that it's because of movements like ours and our allies. So for people who don't know, the Michigan Public Service Commission was entertaining a rate increase request. They do this every single year. I think it's every other year, actually. DTE will come to the Michigan Public Service Commission and say, we need to charge more for power because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And usually the Michigan Public Service Commission says, okay. And what DTE was asking for was actually rather outrageous this time. They were asking for an 8.8% increase in our power bill. In addition, they wanted to add a new punitive rate class for every person with rooftop solar. So for those who, basically the way that your power bill works is that power costs a different amount throughout the day, right? During peak load, power is more expensive. During lower load, power is cheaper, right? What DTE wanted to start doing was charge every person that had rooftop solar connected to their homes the highest rate for power for that day all day. And the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association actually did some math on this and found that it would be about $66 to $100 extra per month for every person who had rooftop solar. So obviously the goal of that was just to eliminate any financial incentive for actually doing that. DTE has actually already whittled this down quite a bit. Back in the day, so basically what happens is when you have solar panels connected to your grid, what you do is you actually pump that power back onto the grid and you pull back off the grid because of the way the power works. I'm not an engineer, but that's kind of how it works. And the way it used to work is that DTE would pay you the rate that power costs at that time, and you pull it off at the rate that it costs at that time, right? So essentially, it's like you were getting that power for free, right? Because you're generating it yourself. DTE got the state to pass a law that says actually you have to pay, we have to pay you power at wholesale rates. You have to buy it at retail rates, which means that actually you're giving DTE power and then buying it back for more expensive. And so DTE does all of these crazy lobbying at the state level, which Yusuf was alluding to. These are things that we can eliminate if we had our own power utility, but anyways, I digress. This type of behavior from DTE has led to a lot of outrage, right? It's not just us doing these types of events, spreading this type of awareness. Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, Solidarity, We the People Michigan, and others have been organizing around this. And we brought public hearings, and Michigan Public Service Commission responded to the public pressure, and they only granted about a 1.3% increase, which is still more than we think they should have gotten, but it's historically low. So. Agreed, and we actually have a space on our website to submit that.
What's on the website? Space on the website?
To submit your DTE story. So if any of you have some horrifying DTE power outage stories, please go to the website and submit that. Right there and right there.
I just wanted to earlier you said
The numbers prove environmentally, however, I do need those. Yeah, they're actually the 430th. They've actually got a little bit better. They used to be the third, now they're the 430th. So, ooh. But also DTE spends an enormous amount of money lobbying. In fact, they don't only lobby in Michigan. There actually was a pretty interesting article that came out how DTE is funding dark money groups in California to push against climate legislation there because California tends to lead on a lot of this type of stuff. And so they're lobbying against California out of fear that it'll spread to here.
Just on NPR a couple days ago.
Yep.
That's that story.
Pretty outrageous.
So actually, question. One is there going to be stocks, like shares and stock available for this for people to buy?
So this would be publicly owned. It would be a not-for-profit owned by the city. So it's not that people would buy shares of this. It's just be like another department of the city government.
Okay. So my other question is, I know that with Chelsea, how they have their own, and I was talking with someone and he brought it up how their power went out a lot at first. I personally would not care if my power went out for a couple of days. Like, I'd be fine. But we have two of them, and I don't think their power can go out for very long. So I was wondering how that would work and how, has anyone from U of M said anything about how they feel about their power?
So a couple of things there. For one, I'm not sure if your friends that lived in Chelsea actually live in the portion that is serviced by the municipal utility, because part of Chelsea is actually served by consumers. But when you look at the numbers of outages, Chelsea actually has considerably lower minutes of outages than we do at Ann Arbor here. But getting to the U of M points, first of all, U of M actually has their own separate contract with DTE. So it'd be up to U of M if they wanted to use our power utility or DTE. Now,
They're unaffected.
they would essentially be unaffected. There are plenty of groups at U of M that are advocating for this. GEO, Sunrise, YDSA. So there are people there that are advocating for, public power at the U of M level. We haven't had a lot of success with getting like the regions themselves to move on this, but we're continuing to advocate on it. We're hoping to be able to move them on this. So we'd love for U of M to be part of it, but they get a choice of it.
I just to add something that the hospital has emergency generators like any hospital would have to have.
Oh,
Yeah.
Right. And of course, the idea is that it's not going to happen at first, right? We're going to buy out the infrastructure and we're still going to have DTE scrap the infrastructure. And that's why our power goes out, right? It's because their infrastructure is out of date. However, we'd be able to start upgrading, right? Until we buy it, we can't really start to do that. But once we buy the infrastructure, we can start to upgrade it. We can start to improve our reliability. Yeah, of course. So it comes from a revenue bond. So the city would issue bonds backed by the revenue that we would be generating from paying our electrical bills. And then we would just pay off the service on that debt over time with our electrical bills. And that's what the feasibility study is looking at, is whether we can do that. I believe that DTE owns our streetlights right now, and I think would be buying our streetlights with this deal. Sorry, what was that? I believe that what would happen is we would buy those poles and then we would just maintain our franchise agreement with the other utilities so they'd be able to use them. Because essentially, the city kind of already owns those poles in a way. It's our public right of way, and then we franchise it out to DTE, which is kind of confusing legal mumbo jumbo. But essentially, we would own the power poles and the electrical stuff because those power poles are put up by DTE. They're owned by and serviced by DTE, but we have the right to the right of way that they stand on, like the land that they're literally on. So that arrangement would still stand the same with all those other utilities.
Talking with a friend who had this place on like she gets certified with public with energy that are community utility. She was thrilled with the service because they come out of service very rapidly after their capital. They're actually putting in broadband with the rural areas, so they're actually moving to serve that. So it's just another example of the kind of independent organization that we would have. Make some decisions that will afford the public good beyond just electricity.
Yeah, absolutely.
How long do you guess the feasibility study?
Feasibility study results should be out early summer.
So the 2 to 5 years that we're really when you use the other example, was that 2 to 5 years? That's 2 to 5 years.
That's 2 to 5 years from the time that the city starts the acquisition process. So that's like a legal process the city has to start. Yeah, it could be quicker. It could be longer, right? Unfortunately, it hasn't happened in Michigan in 100 years. So we're going to be kind of building our own path. But yeah, so hopefully it will be quicker. And I think that the more community effort there is and engagement, pushing this forward, the faster it's going to be. But yeah, unfortunately, it is not an easy process, right? There should be no confusion about that.
Well, and one thing I just want to point out, as Greg mentioned, you can eliminate step one if our city council does the first step by ordinance. And this is something that we can all implement. That's why we had to sign in by word. You could go to, I believe that all the new newly elected city council members are attending to have regular coffee hour. You can go to them and talk to them about all the power that we want to see them engaging. That's why we're asking for that. We'd like to see groups in each of the wards really connect with the city council and educate them and engage them in the problem. It's huge. step one is the putting the step one of the process of municipalization forward by ordinance. You can do it by ballot initiative, or we can save a lot of time and effort and money by taking that step by our city council.
Right, so ballot initiative, long slog, city ordinance, much easier, right? The difference is, we need to convince city council to get them to do it by ordinance, which hopefully won't be too hard, but you know, it's tough to ask a politician to take on the largest lobbying firm in the state, right? It's not good for your political career usually to take on a behemoth like DTE. In addition to the fact that there's just a lot of logistical challenges, right? Like city staff is going to have to put effort into this, things like that, right? There are reasons why they have some resistance to this idea, and so it's just going to need to be us showing them that there is public support behind them. That if they take this on, that they are going to have us have their back, and the political winds are going to be in their favor if we want them to pursue this. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much.